Okay, let's start again. So we have two paper presentation. No, in fact, three paper presentation. Sorry, before the lunch. So lunch you will take on your side. So the first paper is by Rick. Rick, please join me here, and the paper is on current and future carbon prices in a risky world, exactly in the topic of the day.
Presumably somebody will. Thank you very much, Christian.
Sorry, no, don't tell me thank you very much before I introduce you. So Rick is a specialist of climate price on carbon pricing. He's a public economist he used to be a minister in Holland, in the Netherlands, and now he's a professor at Oxford University.
Yeah.
Okay. So now you can thank me.
Thank you very much. So this is a paper, it's a presentation based on work with Stan Oleslagers and Sverre van Wijnbergen. I've tried to drop all the mathematics. It's basically a paper about how different types of uncertainties, whether it's in the climate system, whether it's in damages, or whether it's in the economy, how they affect the way you price carbon. Typically, it increases your estimate of your carbon price by many factors. So we're going to talk about it. So to do this, so it's basically on global carbon pricing. So we just had William Nordhaus, who gave a fantastic presentation, and two of his main things were to harmonize carbon prices and to make sure that we get rid of this tipsy-turvy business that the world is full of kind of fossil fuel subsidies. 7% of world GDP is like subsidies for fossil fuel, which is kind of ridiculous. There are carbon bombs all over the place, like the big oil companies. They're still exploring new fields as if there is no tomorrow. So there is a kind of this idea that they maybe it is because they anticipate the end of the good times for them, that finally politicians will wake up and do something about it. But the idea then is so that we want to kind of have more, subsidize the good stuff, the green stuff. And as been shown in the previous talk, there's been very little. So I will also talk about learning by doing in green technologies, things like Swanson's law or Wright's law and things like that, and that we really need to do something to overcome this double externality. I will not talk about harmonization of carbon prices, but I think it's extremely important. I was a politician for many years, and I always ask ministers of finance, can you give me bang per buck? So Bill Nordhaus was talking about carbon prices differing across different countries. But if you look in one particular country, they differ hugely per sector, per type of policy. So you can have maybe a carbon tax, or you may have a quota associated with a quota as a shadow price. And then if you look at them, they vary hugely. For example, some of the largest carbon prices are for subsidizing electrical vehicles. They can be something like 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 euros per ton of CO2 emitted in the Netherlands. Well, there may be all kinds of reasons for that, but they tend to be also fairly going to the rich people in society. so there's something odd about that. But from our point of view, what Bill Nordhaus showed so admirably, which needs to be done for every country, for every particular type of policy in every sector, there's a huge amount of money to be picked up by equalizing these bang per buck ratios. Bang per buck is how much cost reduction can you get, how much CO2 reduction can you get per euro spent or something like that. And we do this in healthcare, where we talk about quality adjusted life years and how much of those you get per dollar or per euro. And you try to, if they differ very much across operations, you're really very unhappy, but then it's very inefficient. So the inefficiency argument, which normally is a large part of my talk, I won't talk about today, but because I'm not talking about it doesn't mean it's very important. It's actually maybe one of the most important things to get towards more efficient policy. So there's a huge literature on what the carbon price should be. And of course, but we're not very good on it, because estimates vary enormously. And we have to be, so I'm very happy that Michael Greenston will talk later about the latest, about estimates bottom up. But most of the integrated assessment models that have been used use, I don't want to say dodgy damage functions, but damage functions associated with a lot of uncertainty. And the same thing is true for other stuff like that. I'm particularly interested because in other work I do, I'm interested in this Dixit-Pindyck problem, where they say that there's this hold-up problems, that firms hesitate to move from, to do the green transition, to reinvest from brown stuff to green stuff, either via direct to technical change arguments or whatever, but you need to take the whole economy lock, stock and barrel and point it from a carbon-intensive direction towards a green direction. For that, I believe you need, you know, like it's an option argument, if you want option price argument, you need to commit to a stable path of growing carbon prices. And maybe for the next 30 years, so that you put a dot on the horizon, so that people know from now on, if you invest in all that rubbish, it's not going to be a very good idea. So I think what we need to be concerned with is not only the level of carbon prices, but also the shape of the time path of carbon prices and what you need to commit to, because that really determines, and many studies have shown that, which I won't go into today, that it doesn't only depend on the current carbon price, but also on expectations about future carbon prices. So I'm going to illustrate some of these ideas. So it's a bit of an kind of a simple model where I'm going to treat carbon prices as an asset price. You don't know what an asset price is. So an asset price is like a stock market price. So what's a stock market price? Is the expected present discounted value of all future dividends. What's the price of a house? The price of a house is the expected present discounted value of all the future rents. What's the social cost of carbon? It's a present discounted value of all damages to aggregate production caused by emitting 1 ton of carbon today. So the same techniques that finance people use to value assets, stock prices, human capital, houses or whatever, can be used linear rector to price carbon. That's only beginning to realized in the literature in the last few years. And it really means that it becomes all very easy because you can just build on that. So, so typically, I know that discounting has been a huge topic of debate in France. So typically you need to therefore discount those future marginal damages. Typically these marginal damages are proportional to economic activity, and you need to use some discount rate for that. So the discount rate you need to use for that needs to be risk adjusted. So normally we say discount rate, it depends on how impatient, how much you prepare to discount the welfare of future generation. I did my PhD in King's College, Cambridge, and Frank Ramsey. So there the idea, it was just seen to be morally offensive to discount the welfare of future generations. So put it at 0 or 0.1%. Others say, well, maybe deduce it from markets and then maybe a bit higher. So that's the first component. The second component is that it depends on how wealthy future generations are. So if you have a lot of growth, then future generations are going to be much richer than poorer than current generations. Then current generations are going to say, well, bugger it. If you're going to be so rich, you solve the climate problem. And that basically means you increase the discount rate and you lower the price of carbon. And therefore you have a less ambitious climate policy. Then third components are that you have to allow for the fact that these damages are growing over time with the trend growth rate of the economy. So you must use a growth-corrected rate of interest, a growth-corrected discount rate. There's a lot of confusion about it, but that's what you need to do. Then come all the risk adjustments. So I'm not giving you the maths of it. So you have normal macroeconomic uncertainty. Often I think like that maybe the growth rate of the economy, of total factor productivity is normally distributed. Then, say like, think of it like geometric Brownian motion. Then you need to have some precautionary saving. So the idea that there's a lot of uncertainty, people rather err on the safe side. So this economist, that means that you're more pissed off about a negative shock than you're happy about a positive shock. Yeah, so we can quantify that term. It depends on your relative prudence of policymakers, depends on risk aversion of policymaking, and depends on volatility. But we also have lots of shocks in the economy, which is what the previous speaker talked about, to do with tail risk. And the tail risk are, for example, one way of looking at it, that they're the risks of rare macroeconomic disasters. So that's often been done by an economist, Robert Barrow. So associated with that tail risk is also precautionary saving. They depress the they depress the discount rate, basically because there's more precautionary saving. So to clear that market, you need to have a lower discount rate, and that means you have a higher price for carbon and a more ambitious climate policy. So that's what's going on there. And then the last term, and we're getting close to the territory. This is the real expert who's sitting next to me. You will have an insurance term. And the insurance term is the idea that in future states of nature, the economy is doing very well, then damages are very high as well. If damages are high and the economy is doing well, then in a sense, the marginal utility of consumption is high in that future state of nature, so marginal utility of consumption is low. So you have an insurance mechanism. So you actually raise the rate of interest and become less ambitious in your climate policy. So what you're saying is that it's almost like the beta there, which is this kind of, is almost close to 1 in most of these integrated assessment models. So this is a bit like by recap. So we're going to kind of look at a benchmark model. I'm going to give you a very simple model, and then I make it simple, and then I show a number of extensions just for the discussion. This is a general, I was asked to give a more general lecture, so that's what I'm going to do. So the first part is that in the benchmark model, I'm going to assume that damages are proportional to output, and they're a linear function of temperature. And then secondly, I'm going to assume that temperature responds to cumulative emissions. So that means that you have these graphs where you have cumulative emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's almost a straight line if you plot temperature from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution against cumulative emissions, and that's that. And that slope is something which we'll use to calibrate it. If you do that, and if you then maximize social welfare, we'll see that the economy grows roughly, the carbon price has to grow roughly at the same rate as the economy. Then I'm going to discuss with you 5 extensions. What if our damages are more convex? What if we have this double externality which Bill talked about? So we were going to have learning by doing or something like that, green technological progress that's endogenous. Then I'm going to talk about a topic, when I ask finance people, what's the best paper on carbon pricing? For example, I ask Patrick Bolton, he would say this paper by Daniel et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called On Declining Carbon Prices. I was a bit shocked to hear him say that, but I respect him highly. He's one of the best finance guys I know, and he's a lovely guy. So I want to look at that argument and see if it's valid or not. Then I will look at the effects of climate and economic tipping points, and then the main thing is that we're going to talk about temperature cap and how that is going to be very different. So that's my story. It looks a lot, but it's going to show it with you diagrams rather than with maths. So huge literature. Christian, of course, did a lot of stuff on discounting. Thomas Lonsek and Kai Traeger did a lot of stuff on tipping points. You can take it there, but it's not that important now. So we're going to assume that consumption, again, following Nordhaus, is basically proportional to aggregate output. The difference here that aggregate output is just an endowment. Since energy is a small part of the economy, 4, 5, 6%, I don't think it matters that much. I've worked mostly with general equilibrium models, with a whole structure, but I think if you assume that aggregate output follows an exogenous progress, you're not doing that exogenous process, you're not doing that badly. So there is some abatement cost, that means that you have left for consumption, that's A. You have damages indicated by D, that means that there are a lot of damages due to temperature, that means that people have less to consume. So there are economic tipping points, climatic tipping points, and there's learning by doing. So that's a schematic part of the model. I'm going to assume something which is a bit technical to say, but I want you to know it. A lot of people assume that the aversion of policymakers to risk is the same as their aversion to intertemporal fluctuations. That's not a good assumption. You want to typically, empirical evidence suggests that the aversion for risk is rather greater than the aversion to intertemporal fluctuations. If that is the case, which it seems to be the case empirically, then policymakers, societies, have a preference for early resolution of uncertainty. And that's what's captured with what's been known in that literature by something called Epstein-Zinn preferences. So don't look at the equation, but basically there's a growth rate for output equation, which basically has a first part, which is just, it's called geometric Brownian motion, but basically saying that the growth rate of the economy has a drift, it's called mu, and it's got a volatility sigma. That last term, the disaster terms, these are these disastrous terms associated with Robert Barrow. So there is a risk of every so many years that the economy gets a big hit, and then we know the distribution of all these disasters. So we're trying to calibrate via a power distribution the size of these disasters, and we know something about how often they arrive. Yeah. So then well, we said that. So the emissions are proportional to output. We can do them. We can also assume that there's an amount mu, which is the amount of the total energy mixed that is abated. So that's become renewable, and an amount 1 minus u that is not abated. And the cost of abatement is a convex function of mu, and it's just exactly as in the Nordhaus models. So here it is. So we're going to look two assumptions. One case is where we have the exogenous case with exogenous technological progress. So the abatement costs are convex function. So that means that the marginal cost of abatement increases in how much you abate. But there is also a declining time trend, and that's just exogenous technical progress, typically about 2% per year, something like that. And then we look at the second case where we know it's called Wright's law, more generally for renewable energies, or Swanson's law for solar panels or photovoltaics, that every time you double the number of solar panels in use, you find that the cost of these chaps per panel drops by about 20 to 30%. Every time you double the number of windmills in use, their cost drops by about 30, 40%. Every time you double the number of batteries in use, their cost drops by that. So there's a huge number of studies, typically done by engineers who calibrate that. That mathematical formulation has just been chosen so that I can immediately back out that coefficient C1, and then I can calibrate it to capture that. So the idea is not that technological progress is exogenous, it's not manna from heaven, but it is actually endogenous. And it's not, importantly, it's not internalized. It is an extra externality that needs to be dealt with by policymakers. So we need two instruments. It's this target and instrument story again. You need one instrument to price carbon and another instrument to subsidize these renewable energies to overcome these learning by doing externalities. Okay, so then we have these temperatures, a linear function of cumulative emissions. The transient climate response to cumulative emissions is for every trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere, temperature rises by 1.8 degrees Celsius. Sorry, it says Kelvin, that reveals my background as a physicist, but it's just degrees Celsius for those. But then we have the damages. If theta T is 0, they're just linear temperature, but theta T controls the convexity of damages. We have a way of controlling the skewness of shocks, and the shocks have mean reversion. Okay, let me just move on to some stuff. So the way you solve it eventually is that the marginal abatement cost has to equal the sum of the social cost of carbon and the social benefit of learning. Where the marginal abatement cost is actually, some people said you should price carbon at the sum of the social cost of carbon and the social benefit of learning. I think that's wrong. You should price carbon at the social cost of carbon, and you should subsidize renewable energies at this thing called the social benefit of learning. What is the social benefit of learning? The social benefit of learning is the expected present discounted value of all future cost reductions resulting from installing one solar panel today. So it's exactly analogous to the social cost of carbon. So in a first best world, you would do them both. But to implement them, you don't do them like many engineers have said in these nature journals, that you just have one price equal to the sum. That's wrong. You need to implement it separately. So here I've got a calibration. Let's forget about it, but I will come to it later. So this is the benchmark model. So if you see the gray area, these are the 5%, 95% likelihood ranges, or quintiles, if you want. Percentiles, sorry. The black lines are either the median when it's solid, or they're the mean if it's dashed. So what you see on the top left panel is the social cost of carbon rises roughly in line with in tandem with the economy. You see that in the top right panel, where you see the cost of carbon corrected for growth. And then you see that's more or less flat. So if you have linear damages, it's more or less flat. You see the abatement rate. You start with about 10% of the fossil fuel energy may be abated, and it goes up to about 40%. It's not really enough. Temperature is still way too high. It's close to 3 degrees. The blue line is just one possible realization. So what you see is that the cost of carbon actually responds quite strongly to GDP. You may not like that, or you may not like it, but that's a consequence of those models. So if you don't like it, you want to do something else about it. So this is kind of the benchmark story, if you want. And then temperature going up as emissions go down. Of course, if you fully abated the economy, if the abatement rate, you manage to get it to 100%, then the temperature will become flat. So let's now look that we have convex damages. So with convex damages, we calibrate the same. We used this study by Moffat and Nordhaus, I believe. They did a meta-study to correct a Dutch economist, Richard Toll, I think, avoiding double counting, giving some reliability measures, and then we fitted also a convex specification to that data set. It's a bit, but then what you see, the point is, and it's not so convex as Marty Weitzman would have liked it. It's a bit convex, it's mildly convex. But what you see, if you look at the growth-adjusted social cost of carbon, it's no longer flat. It starts about $87 per ton of carbon, and then it kind of rises over time. So this, of course, it rises much more than that, but it rises by more than the growth rate of the economy. So convexity doesn't only give you higher carbon prices, it also gives you much faster growing carbon prices. As a result, the abatement rate shoots up to about 80% rather than the 40% before. So just fitting to the same data, the same metadata, a linear specification and a convex specification as well as you can, gives wildly different results. This is something for us to discuss, I think, because both are valid in a way. You look at temperature, of course, it stabilizes now at a lower rate. It's not quite stabilized yet. So that's the effect of convexity as a first sensitivity run. So now we allow for this double externality, which was already discussed in the first lecture. And I'm going to assume that there's no longer exogenous technological progress, but now there is endogenous technical progress caused by Wright's law or Swanson's law or whatever. So now what you see is you have two policy instruments. On the top left panel, you have the growth-adjusted social cost of carbon. The fact that it rises means that it grows faster than the growth rate of the economy. And on the right-hand side, you have this spike, if you want, in the growth-adjusted social benefit of learning. So the top left panel is like the growth-corrected carbon price. The top right panel is the growth-corrected social benefit of learning. So and then if you add them up together, you get the bottom left-hand panel, and that's often been advocated by engineers or climate scientists. We should have this initial spike in carbon price, and it should go down. I think that's wrong, because really what you have a rising carbon price. But you have this spike in the social benefit of learning, the subsidy for energies. I've not got time to show it here, but was we're in Paris. There are people like David Hermous and Philippe Aghion, and those kind of guys. They would use a direct technical change model. You would get a similar kind of implication as that top right panel, but it would actually be even more concentrated. You basically get a big spike in green subsidies to pick that economy from a dirty direction and shove it in the way of a clean direction. So in their models, you have these laboratory scientists, say white coats, and you take the white coats and you take them from the brown sector and make them work in the green sector. And that's what that subsidy does. That's the Acemoglu, Aghion, Hermous story. And of course, then what you see, of course, that the temperature is now pleasantly, more like 2 degrees. But then again, you see can be huge variations in these policies for particular sample runs. So these black lines are kind of an average of all these blue lines. They are not calculated by Monte Carlo, but you can calculate that using the Fokker-Planck equations, which are associated with this dynamic problem. But I realize this is probably just a technical comment which you should ignore. So now we come to this Patrick Bolton, and who then tells me, look, you're all wrong. All these rising carbon prices in your models and, you know, based too much on Nordhaus and all that stuff, it's all wrong. It should be going down. And their argument was, they have a 7-period model, so maybe 7 decades or something like that. And their argument was really, look, over time, you learn. So then you get disasters hit the economy all the time, climate disasters, whatever disasters, or about damage shocks. And then the uncertainty about these damages, it becomes smaller. And then since there's less uncertainty over time, you need to do less precautionary policies, less precautionary savings. So in a sense, the risk-adjusted discount rate will be higher, and therefore the price of carbon will be lower. So their argument was that the carbon price should be falling over time. So what we show here is that the optimal carbon price consists of 2 components. One, let's call it the Nordhaus component, which is something growing in line with the economy. And second, maybe the component which is this declining component due to greater resolution of uncertainty. So we show here the shocks, the volatility, the shocks, the uncertainty to damages gradually falling back to zero. And then as a result of that, you see that the growth-adjusted carbon price no longer rises over time. It's not flat, but it falls. And that's that Daniel et al. Effect in proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. But if I were to plot the carbon price uncorrected, it would still be growing over time. It would just be growing less fast than the growth rate of the economy. So I think, so simple changes will, and of course you do less abatement and less temperature. I will move on. So now I want to show you another things what these carbon prices and the shape of these carbon prices depend on. So I've been talking a lot with Timothy Lenton, a colleague of Ben Groom in Exeter. So he's a climate scientist. And he says, well, we're really not really sure about this temperature sensitivity, this climate sensitivity to cumulative emissions. We just, you know, it may be 1.8, but it may be 2.5. So he says, why don't you try to say kind of there may be, at some point, there may be some probability that it actually goes up. It's not only that they're unsure, but it's also they think it may suddenly jump up. There may be a tip, so that you get a regime shift and a completely different climate physical system. So the suggestion was then you take the probability that that occurs, rises with temperature. So as global warming goes up, you find that you get a bigger chance of this tipping point, that there is a climatic disaster. So maybe the initial expected time for this disaster is 167 years, but it drops to maybe expected time that it occurs is 80 years at 2 degrees Celsius. So then what you see is that if you look at the growth-adjusted carbon prices, so we still have linear damage, it rises over time. You see that big jump in the blue line, that's a particular sample run. So that was a realization around 2060. And then after the climate disaster, you realize there's this tipping point that the climate system has become much worse. Maybe because of the melting of the ice sheets or whatever, reversal of the Gulf Stream. So that the climate sensitivity has gone up, and that therefore you need to price carbon much more. So that you get a jump increase in the price of carbon because of this climate disaster, and then it stays fairly flat. And then the black line is an average of all these blue sample lines. So basically the story there is that tipping points in this very simple model will lead, if it's a climatic tipping point, will lead to a sudden increase in the cost of carbon. So this mimics exactly in a much more complicated model what Kai and Lonsek did in their Journal of Political Economy paper. So we can contrast that with an economic tipping point. So there's something called an MDAT database, and they give loads of climate disasters. They are different from the macroeconomic disasters of Robert Barrow. So these climatic disasters, these economic disasters stemming from global warming, the probability of those occurring will also increase with temperature. So they typically destroy about 2.5% ago, not as much as these shocks of Barrow. They are smaller, but they occur more frequent, and they have an annual risk of 0.01 times temperature. So the expected time of arrival of a tipping point drops from 100 years now to about 50 years at 2 degrees Celsius. So then what you see, if you now look at that blue line, just a sample, and there you see that the tip occurs in this particular realization around 2100. And then, because you get an economic disaster, the economy shrinks. So therefore, damages will be small. You have less emissions, damages will be smaller, and therefore you need to price carbon much less. And that's why it drops down. So when we're looking at paths for the cost of carbon, we need to look whether, at the effects of climate tipping points, economic tipping points, and that they have these completely opposite effects. I come to the final discussion, and that's to do with a temperature cap. So I need to explain a little bit before I show this to you. We economists seem to be obsessed with welfare maximization. That's the way we've been brought up, and that's what we do. So, and Biden, of course, has asked, please give me a social cost of carbon, and he wants one figure. That's going to be difficult. But of course, the IPCC has kind of given up on that. Please correct me later if I put it too strongly. But they take this more engineering approach and say, well, I started physics, and my PhD was in control engineering. So engineers, you always have a kind of a resilient economy, a resilient engineering thing. You just have a cap. You're not allowed to go above it. We don't know where it comes from, but it's become a focal point. So everybody wants to go on this tour, this 1.5 degrees Celsius. We don't want to go higher than that. But then you can ask yourself, what does that imply for policy? So imagine that you ignore damages and you just have this cap of 1.5 or 2 degrees. So then you will find that you get a hoteling rule. It's something similar to what Christian will discuss in much more detail later on. And then you should ask yourself, it's not to do with welfare maximization, it's to do with cost minimization. So it's an arbitrage argument. You want to be indifferent as an economy between paying carbon taxes now and between paying carbon taxes next year. So the expected present discounted value of the carbon tax next year has to equal the carbon tax this year. So that means that carbon taxes have to grow at some rate of interest. The question is, of course, what kind of rate of interest? Well, it should be a risk-adjusted rate of interest. But anyway, let me first show you, before I go into that the abatement rate has to go up to 100%. See it on the top right figure? You see that temperature, that's the only way temperature can stay below 2 degrees. And if you look at the growth-adjusted the growth-adjusted carbon price, you've on the top left panel, it rises a hell of a lot. So that's showing that it grows much faster than the growth rate of the economy. Christian would say it should grow at about maybe 3.5%, 4%, that order of magnitude, depending what your estimate of the risk premium is. So what we see there is wildly different carbon prices and wildly different shape of carbon prices than what we get out of the welfare maximization exercises. It may begin a bit lower, but because it grows much faster, it still does the job of keeping temperature between 2 degrees, lower than 2 degrees, or lower than 1.5 degrees. If you impose a cap of 1.5 degrees, the abatement rate reaches 100% much earlier, around 2050 or something, or maybe even lower, depending on the calibration of your model. So I want to make 2 comments. The first comment is a technical comment. So the way you solve these dynamic programming problems is to solve for value functions and policy functions. So you're solving for an abatement rate as a function of temperature. If you look at the abatement rate as a function of temperature, for any of the other models with welfare maximization, it's either flat. So if you look at the abatement rate plotted against temperature, optimal abatement rate against temperature, it's flat. For linear damage, for convex damage, it's mildly increasing. But if you plot the policy function for this temperature gap, it's wild. It goes whoom, and it goes up to 100%. As you approach the cap 2 degrees, you have to do an enormous amount of extra action to prevent you overshooting it. So it's a wildly different policy, and that should be realized. The second point is a point which will be made better by Christian than by me. But in our model, we have this thing that the expected rate of increase in the carbon price, which is the marginal abatement cost, has to equal a safe rate of interest, a risk-free rate of interest. Think of it as, say, 0.8% or 0%, a return on treasury bills, a return on bonds, plus an expectation term where mathematically there's a quadratic variation between the stochastic discount factor and the marginal abatement cost. So let me give you the intuition. If changes in consumption and the marginal abatement cost are positively correlated, then the stochastic discount factor and the marginal abatement cost must be negatively correlated. And if that's the case, you can see that that risk premium will be positive and that the carbon price has to grow at a rate faster than the safe rate of interest. I'll leave it for Christian, because there may be different stories to tell us, but I think in our model, it's clearly a positive thing, and it's a big risk premium. So our thing grows also about a bit bigger than 3.5%. I'm almost done. So here you have, if you do the temperature cap, and you also have convex damages, then something interesting happens. Then the growth rate of the carbon price is no longer at the growth rate of the economy. It's no longer at the growth rate of the risk-adjusted rate of interest, but it's at somewhere in between. So if you allow for damages and a temperature cap, it's somewhere in between. And you can see that from looking at the growth-corrected carbon price on the top left panel. It again does the job. You get 100% abatement rate, and the temperature stays below 2 degrees. So I want to sum up. So investment decisions that have to be made by the private sector, businesses and corporations, depend not only on the carbon price today, but on all carbon price in the future. So they need to know something, what we think about that carbon price path. So with convex damages, carbon prices grow faster than the rate of growth of the economy. With gradual resolution of damage uncertainty, when you gradually know more and more about the shocks hitting the economy due to temperature, then you will lower the growth rate of the carbon price. Learning by doing effects increase abatement efforts, but require a separate technology subsidy, not an early peak in carbon price. So this is the last slide. So what should be done, or what are important things? So apart from the things that have been already exposited in the first presentation today, I think we need to think more about models where we make investments really endogenous. Most models, integrated success models, if you're honest, the investment story is a little bit textbook-like. And we should allow for investments in different sectors, that there are adjustment costs, that it takes time, that it's difficult to shove investment from capital stocks, say from a coal-fired power station to a solar-fired power station. You can't change it immediately. It may be completely irreversible. We need to allow for it. In that case, there are option price arguments, and we think of Dixon and Pindyke. We need to also think about collaterals. So many firms, they need money to invest. So here's the problem. If you're a steel factory and you're not doing any green transition, you're sitting on your hands. And then at the moment, the government steps up climate policy, their share prices go down. Following Kiyotaki more and things like that, their collateral constraint will bite. They find it harder to borrow. So just when they need to borrow most, they can't. Just when they need to borrow most to finance the green transition, they can't. I have not seen a paper on it, but I think it's crucially important, particularly also in a stochastic context. Technological progress should be more Schumpeterian or more the directed technical change. I've discussed it about that. And then the biggest problem, and here I echo what has been said by the previous speaker, is that too much of our work has been on cloud cuckoo land economics and too little on second best or third best, the nitty-gritty of the political economy. So, for example, we know when we delay climate policy, it becomes much, much more expensive. One, you get closer to the cap, so you need to take much more action, so it's much more volatile, it's very inefficient. Secondly, if you wait, you have less time to build up green learning by doing. You have less time to retrain those scientists who have to work on green rather than brown. So it is very costly. The more you wait, the worse it is. Not in those models, but what you see when I started with these carbon bombs, if you wait, then these guys who are still pumping oil and gas, they do it much more vigorously. They say, let's explore as much as possible whilst the going is good. And that's, of course, only accelerating global warming. So delay is absolutely terrible. The point is, if you have a delay and that type of political problems, because politicians procrastinate, they prefer subsidies rather than taxes. We can't really use the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, so we need to move away from command optimum, and we need to face the hard reality of designing policies in a nitty-gritty world of market economies. So I'll leave it at this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick.